Coming up, 2025 was the year Ontario was to be the most accessible place to live. Why has it not reached its target?
You're listening to Double Tap, your daily accessible technology show. Now, here's your hosts, Stephen Scott and Shaun Priest.
Hello. Welcome to Double Tap for another day. And Shaun Priest, how are you?
For another day. Don't make it sound like it's a drudge, like it's a chore. Hooray! We're so lucky. Another Double Tap. Hello, Double Tappers. How you doing?
Actually, to be honest, I'm very happy to be here today. Sometimes the world can just feel a little bit chaotic, a little bit noisy, a little bit like, there's just a big crowd outside your door chanting, stop buying keyboards. Do you ever feel like that in your house?
Yes, all the time. The shed is an escape. It's strange. I love the holiday period, of course, but, it's nice to sort of get back to normality.
Well, the problem is the normality is kind of feeling, I want to go back to the holiday period because, normality is just awful. But look, I do want to talk about something because, and I'm diving right in today with this because, honestly, I am so excited.
What Stephen bought this week?
I bought a thing!
Ooh, okay, you bought a thing, and we all know what it's going to be. It's a keyboard.
Well, it might be a keyboard. And now, look, I will warn you that during the course of this episode, a keyboard may well arrive at the front door of my house.
Back to normality. It's
That's
a weekday, a keyboard's going to turn up.
It may well be the case that during the course of the program, I get a ring at the doorbell and suddenly it's a keyboard here. I did order one of the new, Sateki, which is a San Diego company. They're kind of known for things like, Mac accessories. You get like USB hubs or stands for your iMac. They do a really cool little device which sits just over the top of the iMac base. And you can, put a little hard drive in there and you can expand the port selection on the back.
Yeah,
they
make peripherals, right? But they're sort of a high quality. I sort of put them with Belkin.
Yes.
It's that sort of level. Right. Yeah, Anchor, Belkin, yeah.
And I think it was last year they got into the world of keyboards. And they only have one. They have a mouse and they have a keyboard, which they've built for the Mac. And they had built like a laptop-style keyboard, mechanical, which it was getting a lot of interest. And that was quite nice, and I liked the sound of it. But kind of wanted a numpad, and I thought, if they ever bring out one with a numpad, I'm all in. And then at CES, they announced one with a numpad, and I'm like, right, let's see if it's available. It was, and it's arriving today. I'm very excited.
That's a novel feature, isn't it, Stephen Scott? It's not like any of the hundreds of other keyboards you've got have got a numpad.
Do you mean like the hang on? So you mean like the I've got the MX keys here.
Yes.
And this other MX key's here. And then the other one I've got here.
All right, stop it. Yes, you have a world of keyboards. The thing is, though, right, full size, I agree with you. I go with full size now. I totally agree with you. The better option, right, for most people, if you got the space and you don't need it for portability, whatever. But don't you find you get confused with all these different keyboard layouts? I am replacing every keyboard I've got with the MX keys because I know exactly, the layout. There's no confusion there. It's like using one keyboard for everything because basically I am. So why is this? Why are you doing?
I don't know. So my wife likes collecting shoes, and I thought for me it's keyboards. I'm not saying it's like a thing you need to have. It's just a thing I like to have. So, yes, I will tell you more about it when it arrives, but it hasn't arrived yet. That's not what I want to talk about, though. I want to talk about something else. I mean, I'll mention it briefly because it's one of those devices which I mention it because I know there's a lot of you out there who are interested in recording audio and high-quality audio, and that can be for lots of different purposes. It can be for recording your own podcast or your own content, creating your own show, or it might be just to, make your Zoom and Teams calls sound better. And there are lots of devices out there that can help you do this. But of course, the challenges we've noted many times is accessibility of these devices. You'll get a piece of hardware, some brick that arrives at your house and it comes with companion software, which is useless and is equally as useful as the brick you've just bought.
Yes.
Elgato, Rode, looking at you guys, just not making the software accessible to us. So the Stream Deck, which is an incredibly powerful piece of kit, it's just not accessible unless you've got some sighted help.
It's incredibly frustrating. Sorry to jump in, but it just is. I am using a Stream Deck right now for muting, for opening various websites, and you had to set this up with me, with Mark and other people, because the software is just... it's not just a little bit, oh, it's frustrating to use. The usability isn't great. It is totally inaccessible.
Yeah.
And I honestly, it's not good enough. It really isn't. And the same with the road. And anyway, sorry, carry on.
Yeah. And of course, I mentioned at the top, I just want to mention as an aside, of course, we are going to be, the second half of the show today is focusing on a conversation I had with David Lepofsky, speaking of inaccessibility of Ontario, which is a huge story. The Accessibility for Ontarians Act was meant to come to fruition in 2025, and unfortunately, it just seems like it hasn't managed to achieve what it set out to do 20 years ago. It's not like they haven't had the time. 20
yes,
years to sort
not
this
long
out.
enough. Well, I mean, we joke about that. I'm so interested in that conversation because what is the reason? I mean, is it true that 20 years actually is not a reasonable time to make those adjustments? I can't for the life of me see why, but
it shows that the legislation is important, and it's great that it's there on the books, but it has to have teeth. And one thing we'll talk about with David, and it kind of ties into this, is how this could impact on technology. Now, is anyone suggesting that Canada as a country on its own could potentially change the direction of companies that have accessibility functionality or lack of accessibility functionality? Well, some might say no, but I think possibly yes. And not only that, you can go one step further and say, well, look, any change that happens, and I think we've all seen how the European Union has had an impact on huge tech companies, worldwide tech companies. Apple, USB-C is just one example of that.
Yep.
Where they've said, look, this is the way it's going to be here. If you want to sell your products into the European Union, they have to be made this way. If the same rule was applied within, say, an Accessibility Act, then a company like Elgato or Rode could be challenged and say, hey, look, you got to make your products accessible. And of course, in turn, that would make accessibility available to all of us. I mean, I can't imagine a company seriously turning around and making a product accessible just for one country, right? You would do it for all countries. Why wouldn't
yes.
you?
Because
it would kind of go against the whole
countries.
point, of the whole thing. So, this is kind of where, the challenge for us when you're buying products is, you get all this fancy hardware and fancy stuff. And, it's funny, the amount of people in my career who said to me over the years, hey, you work in audio. That's just a perfect business for you because, it's totally accessible.
Yes.
I'm like, yeah, the audio is, but have you tried using any of this hardware?
Yeah.
So I have been looking around and I've heard about this product before. Friends of mine have told me about the various range of products from a company called Audient, and they produce a product called the Evo line of audio interfaces. Now, these start off at fairly low price, and they are actually even comparably with, even on the high end, comparably, they are actually very good value for money. But you're talking about a piece of kit which, has a couple of inputs on it at the base level. You could plug in a microphone, a pair of headphones. If you play music, you could plug in an instrument, a guitar, or a keyboard, or whatever you needed to plug in. You can do that with these devices. And then you can record all that to your computer, but you can also use that for your Teams calls and your Zoom calls, and you could use a better microphone and sound better and all the rest of it. But of course, the challenge is configuring all of that. And Audient have actually done a huge amount of work with some, I've got to say, some amazing trailblazers in our blind community who've worked very hard. And I want to name one, that is Scott Chesworth, who's been named a few times. I know Scott well, so do you. Yeah. And, these are great people, not just Scott, there are others as well, but I know of Scott. And, they've been pushing Audient to make this product accessible to blind users. Now, what that means is that the companion software for the Evo line of products, and there are 3 in the range, they can be used, they can be configured. Now, actually, they work best with NVDA because that seems to be how it's best configured. You'll be pleased to hear that.
I find that a little bit strange, but I understand. Yeah, I understand how it works.
I think they've done the right thing, though, because ultimately, it's the free available screen reader to anybody. You don't have to then have a premium on top.
That's
don't get me wrong, and I should be very clear, it does work with JAWS.
I was just going to say that.
Absolutely works fine with JAWS. It's just that what basically I find is that the controls are more obviously laid out. You can control the system in a more methodical and understandable way with NVDA, whereas with JAWS, you're kind of reading from every button and element from the top left to the bottom right. It just doesn't feel the same in terms of where am I? Where am I on the screen? Because my first impression when I plugged it all up, got it working, was, okay, this is great that every button is accessible. It's reading every button. It's reading every slider. It's telling me everything. But I don't understand the context of any of this. And that's what you need. So, I've been learning a little bit about it. I'm a long way to go to figuring this out. It's not the easiest thing. If you're new to this, it's quite a world to get into. But equally, it's quite an exciting one, and it's going to be a bit of a hobby project for me. But I just mention it because it's a very accessible product. And if you were ever looking down the audio interface route and wondering if you could get a product that you could control the software for, have full control of, which when you think about it is a bit of a ridiculous thing that we have to kind of hope for that.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
That's where we're at. And
it is where we're at.
Provides it.
Yeah, that's such a good point you make about the European Union and the rules that they've laid down for, the most relevant one for us was the USB-C and Apple, but we've seen it with Microsoft and their browser choice and things like that in the past, and Google as well currently going through a similar thing. Why isn't there such a hoo-ha-ha about accessibility? Because, you're absolutely right. If there was a rule there, that would happen. I spoke to Elgato about, the inaccessible software, and I've said this before, but, the response I got was, we'll look into that as an advanced feature or an extra feature. Yes. And my point was, this isn't a feature. No. It should be, fundamental when it comes to your software design, accessibility. And I think, if there was a rule in place, companies would have to think about that.
Well, the problem in Ontario is, and we'll talk about this with David, but the challenge is that, the basics aren't even being adhered to here. The basic rules that exist, and one particular example that's coming up is about a building that was created, a new courthouse in Toronto, which was built under this legislation and still pretty much ignored a lot of it. And there's nothing being done about that.
Yeah,
nothing
so whose
at all.
fault is that? Why is it is it a lack of teeth in the law itself? Maybe the fine is so minuscule or the punishment is so minuscule that they don't care about it? Or is it just simply not being enforced? Who's where do we pass the buck here?
But this has always been the debate I've always heard whenever I've attended a conference or I've listened to people talk about this. We talk about the carrot and the stick. Yeah. And at some point there's a carrot, and the carrot is essentially we're looking for goodwill. Look at the benefit here to you and your customers. You can sell more product to more people. You're doing the right thing. Yes. Right? You're doing the right thing by enabling more people to access your product. Why would you not want to do that? Problem is, you have two issues, I think. One is you either get a buy-in, so you get a company like Audient who've actually listened and said, okay, we're going to do this. And we're going to invest time. We're going to invest time with people. We're going to bring them in. We're going to get the advice of blind people. And suddenly you have a product which works. It proves actually, an Audient's a great example here of how when you work with blind people, the result is actually transformative. It means it's actually a meaningful response. It means something to me because when I go to the product, when I hear that a guy, whether I knew Scott or not, the fact is I know that a blind person who's a musician has had hands-on with this and is using it. That gives me the confidence. And I have to be very strict when I say this because it's important. And I don't mean this to sound rude, but I'm talking about someone who's totally blind has used this. That's important in this situation. Yeah. Because it cannot be. I've heard so many examples when I listen to certain podcasts or listen to certain other shows where people are on who are blind, or you'll get one or two things. You'll either get, I got some sighted help. That immediately is okay, right. Well, that's no use then, right? Because if you needed sighted help, it's not accessible, right?
Yeah, it's true.
So that's one thing, because I always think you have to look at it from the point of view of someone who's at home alone trying to do this for themselves. Can they do it without any vision at all? And if the answer is no, you need sighted help, then it's not accessible, not fully.
Yeah.
And then you have the other side of the coin, which is, it works for me, it's accessible, but a totally blind person has never touched it. It's someone who is low vision. Again, no issue with that. Absolutely, that's a big part of it. You got to think about contrast. You got to think about font size control. You got to think about all these elements as well. It's two different things, in my view. And it's funny, actually, we've been debating this over the whole conversation around Braille as well. But, the whole kind of division between blindness and low vision, I think is something we need to not I don't want to use the word divide, but they are different. The experiences are
different. You need
different.
to recognise there is a difference there, yeah, obviously.
And it's really important for both sides, right?
Yeah, what the accessibility needs or requirements are totally different.
I read a lot of people online who say, you know what, not every blind person uses a screen reader. And it's so true, right? So it's like if we're only talking about screen readers, we're missing the point about low vision. And that's really important. So this is why this whole lumping together thing doesn't always work when it comes to accessibility. But that's why you need multiple voices in the room. Anyway, okay, that's a whole other debate.
Yeah, sorry, we're going off on a tangent. But
nothing unusual here. But we're back to normal. But I just want to say a huge shout out to Audient, huge shout out to Scott and all the people who were involved in making this product accessible.
Yeah, there was more people than Scott, we should say that.
Absolutely.
I was talking to him
the
about
end result of this is that I was comfortably able to buy this product knowing it was going to be accessible. The challenge we now face, and this is with Audient, but it's with every company, is once you've got the buy-in, it's keeping the buy-in. It's keeping it.
How do you mean?
So a good example of this is Sonos.
Oh.
Now, we heard the news this week about Sonos, and their chief executive has decided to stand down. Is it Patrick Spence, I think his name was?
Spence, that's it. Yeah, I wanted to say Patrick Stewart, but yes, Patrick Spence.
No, I don't think he was. I don't think he was in that film. Maybe he'll be the guy that's the star of the Sonos story. Who knows? To accessibility and beyond.
Beyond, definitely.
Yeah,
yeah.
To accessibility and miss.
He did resign, and it was. It was pointed to the terrible mess that the iOS Sonos app turned out to be.
Yeah.
I mean, we should say it's much more usable now, but still, the whole process was handled terribly.
Well, of course, they lost trust with people. That was the problem. They lost trust, and especially within the blind community. Now, whether they factored that in and whether that was a factor in his decision to resign, I don't know. It's probably the bigger issue that's the real reason behind it. But of course, there's no doubt there would be an impact there as well. But I would admit it's probably more of a ripple in the pond than anything else.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. If it was purely the accessibility was totally ruined in the app, would the impact have been the same?
Would he resign?
Absolutely not. It's the fact that mainstream, couldn't set their alarms or whatever it may be.
Exactly.
That this had come to the level that it did.
Sad reality. But this is what I'm talking about with buy-in. So you get buy-in, you get a company like Sonos that comes along and puts a lot of effort in to make their product accessible, and then something changes because they have to rush out a new product. And therefore, in order to do that, certain things have to be pushed aside. Now, how that's characterized inside the organization, whether it's even a factor, I imagine it is somewhere along the line. But what you tend to find in these companies is the accessibility department is usually in the basement, a little room with 3 guys in it, sitting there saying, I hope we can, deal with this huge change that's coming to the Sonos app, which is, by the way, a whole new app. And being told, you've got about 4 days to figure it all out. Good luck.
Yeah.
That's, I think, probably more likely what goes on inside a lot of these companies. Accessibility is often the last thing they think about. And it's also the people who are actually tasked with fixing it are usually the smallest team in the building. And that's a real shame. So this is why I talk about, it's important that these companies, and we should recognize companies who do well, but we want the continued buy-in. Blindness doesn't go away and get better over time. It tends to be with us for the rest of our lives. So for that reason, the products I own, the products I've bought, I want them to continue working. It's often the case that when you buy a product, especially an unknown, like I bought this thing, and I'm thinking, this is great that it's accessible, but if they ever make an update that kills the screen reader functionality, that product is now a brick to me.
So true. Yeah. Yeah,
and you have to. You've got to buy a product at some point, right? We've all got to make a decision. We've got to jump in somewhere, but it is a challenge. That's the reality we live in. The reality we live in is a product we buy today could just fall apart
and be bricked. It's strange because you mentioned about when you say you work in audio, everyone says, of course you do. You're blind. Yeah, of course, audio. That makes total sense. But and even myself, I often think, accessibility has improved so much across the board. But then you get to a certain brand or a certain segment of technology, and you suddenly realize, wow, accessibility is just not there. And, audio mixers is a great example of that.
Yeah. I mean, look, you know about the Roadcaster and how much the potential there.
I love this thing. I cannot use it. I've got to get someone to set it up for me and then I can use it. But I can't make any changes. I can't do anything to it because it's totally inaccessible. And the annoying thing is, with all the, as you mentioned, companion apps these days, absolutely no reason why I couldn't access all the functions and features of this mixer through through software and make that software accessible. It's just not important enough to Rode. Just isn't.
Yeah. And it's not good enough, And the thing is that there's often a tendency for companies to want to push back. And as soon as they do, I think, you know what? Why are you pushing back on this? I don't understand why you don't want to sell products to more people. It's as simple as that. I do not what? Are you allergic to money? What's wrong with you?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it just feels like it's the same old conversation again. But as I said, sometimes you think, okay, we're really moving forward with this, and then something comes along, and you think, no, some attitudes you come across, I should say, I think.
Well, I can definitely say that the Audient Evo range of interfaces are accessible and definitely worth checking out if you were ever looking to go down that road.
You set yours up.
I've managed, a lot of learning involved. Set it up, yes, but that doesn't mean it's being used yet. I'm still kind of like, scratching my head trying to figure this out.
You're confused, but at least you're accessibly confused.
I'm accessibly confused. Yes. I think the thing is, this is the first time I'm using a device like this fully non-visual, right? So I've no idea visually what's going on the screen. So I'm trying to learn it audibly, if that makes sense. I'm just trying to kind of figure this out in my head. And that's a bit of it's definitely a challenge. But
is this the first mixer audio interface you've used with no visual, no zoom, no magnification at all? This is purely, it's interesting, isn't it? That there's that difference there.
Oh, it's huge. I mean, because you have to mind map it, right? At least I do. I don't know if that's just because I come from the visual world, right? So, does everyone do that? But I feel,
I think so.
Yeah, because I'm always trying to build the picture in my head.
Yeah.
Of like, okay, so that, because you're doing it for a couple of reasons, right? Because you're almost listening for, okay, I've gone past, we all do this, right? I've gone past that button.
Yes,
so
the landmark.
So next time I find this, I know it's after this, after mile marker 43.
Yes, 4 tabs on.
That's where the diner is, But no, very, very interesting piece of hardware, that's for sure. So yes, looking forward to that. I've just been told in my ear that my keyboard has just arrived, so it is awaiting my perusal. It's going to be exciting.
Oh, so boring. Okay, cool.
Right, look, let's move on because here's a topic that Negative Julian thinks we won't talk about. Well, Julian, I think you know us well enough to know we'll talk about anything, but okay, let's see what you think.
Hello, chaps, and Laura. I think I should type this one so as to get my thoughts right. This is one time when I do not feel cheerful about being negative. You have for many years grumbled about the cost of accessible tech, but there has been a great silence from you and others about how this may be about to get much worse. Like it or not, Donald Trump has been elected President of the United States. One of his key policies is to slap a 60% tariff on everything from China. Since a huge amount of tech either comes from China or contains components from there, surely the price of accessible technology must soar. Granted, this will directly affect the USA, but the rest of us must suffer in what will be a global trade war. At the same time as this is going on, Elon Musk seems to have been given carte blanche to make the American government more efficient. If he takes the same approach to that as he did to turning Twitter into X and making it more efficient, there may be truly grim times ahead for visually impaired people in the US. I know that you may not consider politics part of your remit, but access to tech must be. Perhaps AMI can put forward someone who can talk authoritatively on the subject. As a sidebar to this, you recently mentioned the Orbit player and questioned why it was only being made available in India. Pure speculation on my part, but is it possible that this is actually good management because India will be a safer, more stable market for the next 4 years? The US, Canada, and Europe may be losing their appeal. I realise this subject may be distressing to contemplate for many people in the blind world, but surely it is best to talk about it ahead of time. There is a fox loose in the henhouse. Looking the other way and pretending it is not there will not prevent a bloodbath of feathers and beaks. There is little point in great new tech being developed if it is unobtainable by the vast majority. Thanks for reading this, Laura. Regards, Negative Julian.
Thank you, Julian. Appreciate that. And look, it is a difficult topic to talk about, partly because we just don't know at this point. One thing we know about Donald Trump is that he says a lot. We don't know what he's going to do about anything. I mean, I think Canada is currently wondering whether or not it's about to be annexed. As is the Panama Canal, as is Greenland. So it's very hard to know because there's so much bluff, there's so much bluster that comes out of the guy. These tariffs, though, do seem to have some kind of traction, though. They seem to get a lot of cheers within America, anyway.
Well, that's because on the face value of it all, it seems like a good idea, to almost sort of encourage homegrown, manufacture and whatever else. But of course, the point is, it's not just going to affect assistive tech. It's going to affect across the board. And there may be some, if it is ever implemented, I think there will be a pushback once you see the prices of absolutely everything just soar. But the point is, of getting someone who actually knows what they're talking about. We don't really get into politics and things like that. As you just said, Stephen, no one knows anything yet. I mean, we can talk about, possibilities and what may happen, but until there's something actually drawn up and in place and, actually a reality, it's very difficult. But I still think it's an excellent point you bring up, Julian.
Yeah, look, it's an important point, and I think we will absolutely discuss it. We are actually going to be talking about it in more detail in the next couple of weeks because we are going to be talking to a couple of people on this topic. But I do want to wait until we see what actually happens. Because like I say, I feel there's a lot of bluff and bluster that comes from Donald Trump. And until the day comes that we get any kind of sense of what's actually going to happen and whatever role Elon Musk plays, I mean, I'll be honest, I think the bigger concern about the whole Donald Trump and Elon Musk bromance that's going on is that the new word is broligarch. Have you heard this? That's the new word that's doing the rounds. It's basically a bunch of rich people running the place, but all good friends. Broligarch. So I think the bigger issue is when they fall out, which inevitably they will.
That's so funny. That's just exactly what I was going to say. They're always friends when it suits themselves. But
well, I think the problem is that Trump is only interested in one person, and that is Donald Trump, right? Elon Musk is only interested, it would appear, in one person, Elon Musk. And so there's a bit of a challenge there. And the problem is if Elon starts getting more attention for doing whatever he's doing that is seen by some as good, that could be detrimental to the relationship.
Yeah,
that'd be my
absolutely. I don't want to get into it too much because arguably that's the nature of politics, no matter who it is anyway.
Here's the. I know you get very scared about all this, but I don't care. But here's the thing. On assistive tech costs, I think that when the loaf of bread you're buying doubles in price, the cost of a braille display is irrelevant at that point. And I think that's the bigger issue here, is that how much impact is all of this going to have? Because look, okay, I say that. I know that you would say, well, a loaf of bread isn't going to change with tariffs. Perhaps not, but if inflation goes up, it will.
As I said about face value, I mean, it's just a crowd-pleasing thing to say. It makes it feel like you're building up your own country, your own manufacturing base. But I think times have changed.
China.
The component level, right?
That's my Donald Trump impression. Did you like
well
that?
Done. It's very bad. At a component level, I mean, everything is sourced from China or wherever else, actually. And tariffs, it's going to have a huge effect on absolutely everything. And once people realize that, I think they'll take another look at it. But at the end of the day, it's just not here yet. I think that's the end of the line.
We'll just stick our fingers in our ears and just pretend it's not happening until it does.
Well, there's just nothing we can say about it, really.
Yeah, well, let's see how it all folds out. But no, it's a great point, and we will definitely return to it. We're not shy of anything here.
Feathers and beaks.
Double
I'm
tapping.
using that one.
Bloodbath. I can't believe we got that far. I can't believe we got so few days into 2025 before the word bloodbath became part of our vernacular. There we go.
We will keep our eye on it as everyone else is, I'm sure, and see what happens with that.
All right, let's move on because I want to talk about the Accessibility for Ontarians Act, which reached a major milestone in January 2025, as news across Canada has been reporting.
By January 1st, 2025, Ontario was supposed to be fully accessible. It was a target set 20 years ago by the province, but disability advocates say the new year has brought a broken legislative promise.
Now, the legislation targeted such areas as workplaces, transit, and public spaces as well.
The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act was hailed as groundbreaking when it passed in 2005.
The ayes are 89, the nays are 0.
And over the years, some progress has been made, but critics say it falls woefully short of what was promised.
We are furious. We are determined, and we are ready.
4 independent reviews in 2010, in 2015, 2019 and 2023 documented significant gaps in the law's implementation. Most of their recommendations were ignored. Last November, at public hearings organised by the AODA Alliance, disabled people shared their stories of the barriers they face daily.
As a member of the AODA Healthcare Standard Development Committee, which provided best practices for the care of people with disabilities, I've seen firsthand how Ontarians face significant barriers to accessing essential medical care.
I myself was caught in the healthcare system in the spring of this year. It was surprising to me how many major hospitals, even in the Toronto setting, were not equipped, nor could they deal with accessible rooms with accessible washrooms. That became a crisis. They could not find me a room in a rehab facility. And consequently, my complications got worse, and I contracted other airborne diseases in the hospital.
My name is Tammy. I'm a parent speaking on my experience within the public education system. My child has a neurological condition defined as childhood apraxia of speech and developmental coordination disorder. We haven't experienced many systematic barriers to accessing accommodations. 3 minutes isn't enough time. Third-party support services worked with our board to create a transition to school plan that was ignored at school level with no parent communication and no responsible oversight. In our experience, individual CERTs currently have the freedom to make decisions on which child is deemed more deserving of IEPs with no transparency or accountability, causing disparity in the delivery of disability accommodations at school level.
Advocates argue that Ontario's lack of progress stems from a failure of leadership. They point to weak enforcement of accessibility standards, insufficient regulations, and a lack of a comprehensive multi-year plan. One example that the AODA points to is Toronto's new $1 billion Armory Street courthouse, built by the government, which contains serious disability barriers, as David Lepofsky, the chair of the AODA Alliance, outlined in a recent video.
Let me show you a $1 billion accessibility bungle, the new downtown Toronto Armory Street courthouse. The courthouse has some good features. Courtrooms have power doors, good acoustics, and space for turning wheelchairs. But important accessibility features are missing or botched. This is despite our warnings about serious accessibility problems for years before the court was built. Jamming 6 criminal courthouses from all over Toronto into one huge downtown Toronto mega courthouse creates new disability barriers. People must travel much further through traffic just to get to court. A longer trip to court saps energy needed for a long day in court from people with chronic fatigue or pain. There's far too little disability parking for the public coming to this court. There's none for the public on the court property, and only 6 street disability parking spots near the court. Any downtown shoppers with disability permits can snatch those spots.
When laws are enforced, change can happen. In Norway, for example, it is now illegal for a website to be inaccessible. Any company found to be non-compliant with the law is given a year to fix the issues. But in the case of Norway's national airline SAS, it wasn't compliant within the time frame and was threatened with a €15,000 fine every single day thereafter. That equates to around $22,000 a day Canadian. After no movement and lots of complaining about how hard it would be to remedy the issues, and with no action whatsoever, the threat of the huge daily fine clearly got them thinking, and in 12 days' time the website was then fixed to everyone's satisfaction, providing change can happen when the law is enforced. The Ontario government maintains that progress has been made, but has yet to issue a formal response to the AODA Alliance's new pledge announced at a news conference at the start of 2025. Led by David Lepofsky, the Alliance outlined practical steps to achieve accessibility across the province.
We are at a pivotal moment in the history of the campaign for accessibility for people with disabilities. We worked with government after government, minister after minister, for 20 years. We made suggestions, we made proposals, we offered advice. But what do we do now? Well, the first thing is this. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act did not vanish on New Year's Day. It's still the law. The Ontario government still has the duty to lead this province to become accessible to people with disabilities. And having missed the legislative deadline, the government has the obligation to get us to that goal as soon after that legislative deadline. The government has the obligation to lead Ontario to become an accessible province as soon after that legislative deadline as possible. We're here to give constructive proposals on how to do it.
For now, the vision of an accessible Ontario seems to be just that, a vision. Advocates say the fight for inclusion is far from over. And joining me now is the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance, the AODA for short Alliance. David Lepofsky is back with us here on Double Tap. David, good to have you here and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, and always good to be talking to you.
Now, I say Happy New Year, but as we're already finding out, it's not a great new year for Ontarians. This law that has been enforced now for a number of years, it doesn't seem to be being implemented.
Well, they're doing some things under it. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act was passed 20 years. It had a commendable, ambitious goal of making Ontario accessible to all people with disabilities by addressing people with all kinds of disabilities, physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, such as blind folks like us, and learning disabilities, autism, and so on, and aiming at tearing down all the barriers we face and ensuring new ones aren't created. And I had the privilege of leading the 10-year fight to get this law passed from 1994 to 2005. It was a grassroots movement. We came up with the ideas that are in the law. We fought across the province to get support for it. We got it passed, and we got it passed unanimously in the Ontario legislature in May of 2025. Now, the government got a good start back then in starting to get it implemented, and there have been some actions, and there have been some improvements. But progress under it slowed and slowed to a point where the pace is glacial. And many, if not most, of the barriers we face remain 20 years later. And the legislation, and it's the first that I know of in the world, set a comprehensive deadline. We had to become an accessible province by 2025, January 1st. Well, we woke up on January 21st, and sadly, and to no surprise, we still live in a province full of serious disability barriers.
So talk me through the issues here. What is this about? Is this a political problem? Is this a lack of enforcement? Is it a lack of interest? Is it that, the law was passed, there was a lot of noise, and since that noise has moved away or moved on to other things, and of course we've had, COVID in the way and everything else, has all of that been factors to slow this bill down, to slow this law down?
All of the above. But I'll boil it down to two huge problems. It's not a problem of public support, because there's been public support for this legislation before it passed and since it did. But there were two huge problems. The first is a lack of leadership at the top of the Ontario government. And that's just not my view. It's the view of 4 government-appointed independent expert reviews. The Act required the government to appoint a person, an independent expert, every 3 or 4 years to take our temperature, see how we're doing, and see what more is needed. And each of those reviews, in increasing tones of severity, said that we're behind, we're not moving fast enough, people with disabilities are not seeing material improvements, and that there's a need for leadership at the government at the top. And unfortunately, we didn't get that. The second problem is when you set about to accomplish something over 20 years, it's really tempting for the people in power to just kick the can down the road. It'll be somebody else's problem. Well, just like if you're an individual and you say, I've got a mission to accomplish something in the next 20 years of my life, you need to set up a plan right at the start, a multi-year plan, a 20-year plan, saying, here's what we're going to get done and here's what we're going to get it done by, so that we're sure we get it all done in time. And the government told us when we proposed this legislation that they needed 20 years because there were so many barriers to remove. And there was pushback in the disability community. Why should I have to wait 20 years? I might not be alive in 20 years. And some of our supporters aren't alive now who fought for this. But it made sense to give people the time they needed. The problem is the government didn't have that 20-year plan. We asked for it over and over. So not surprisingly, the can got kicked down the road, and here we are in a province that does not comply with the province's own legislation.
And you're not taking this lying down. I mean, you've already started essentially a new campaign to enforce the law.
Absolutely. What we've done, we don't believe, and this has been core to the advocacy that I've been involved in, and we're all volunteers. My role as chair of this coalition is a volunteer role. My belief is that when people do things well, you applaud. When they do things poorly, you criticize. But you always come up with constructive suggestions, and realistic ones, doable ones. So what we did on the 6th of January, it was the first day that the legislature building opened in the new year. Now, the legislature isn't sitting, but the building's open. We did a news conference, and at that news conference, we unveiled the multi-year plan that the government needs now. We call it the Accessible Ontario Pledge. It has 10 planks. It's all detailed in the space of about 6 or 7 pages. It's up on our website at aodaalliance.org. And we said we're calling on all the leaders of the 4 Ontario political parties to make the Accessible Ontario Pledge, to say that if they're in power, they'll do it. And for the government that's now in power, we're saying, hey, you're in office. This is your job. Here's the things you need to do. Will you commit to doing this? So we just unveiled that as a constructive agenda, and we're now going to campaign to try to get commitments from all the parties. There's a possibility of an election this spring in Ontario, and if that happens, we'll, of course, be making this an issue in the election.
But it seems ridiculous, doesn't it, David, that you have to go and fight this again, almost litigate this all over again, when the law is on the books. It's not like, does it almost feel like you're back, 20 years ago?
Well, ridiculous is where we live when we do this kind of advocacy, because everybody either has a disability now or gets one later. We're the weirdest minority of all. We're the minority of everyone. So it's kind of ridiculous the government isn't doing its job and therefore hurting the minority of everyone. But that's, when you do disability advocacy, that's what happens. But I am unstoppably optimistic, and that's not because I'm unrealistic. I know what we're up against. But here's the thing. We've got an agenda. We know more about how to do this than we did 20, 30 years ago. We started a movement 30 years ago with 20 people meeting in a room at our legislature. I was one of them. We, at that time, had an impossible dream of uniting people with disabilities. We were only 20 of them, and getting all political parties on side. But in 10 years, we achieved it. that which looked impossible became a reality. And the legislation passed unanimously. Political parties that never agree on the time of day agreed on this legislation. So if you said, do we have an uphill battle now? The answer is yeah, but we know what it means to battle uphill.
Talk me through how this legislation could potentially, at least, if not already, help accessibility on the web in terms of new technologies, because of course that's a huge area for disabled people, which has changed a lot in the past 20 years and has increased, of course, in the last 20 years, the use of technology by disabled people.
Well, you've picked a good example, and in fact it's probably the area where the law had the most impact early on, but has now fallen behind in its implementation. Under the legislation, the government's required to make a series of rules called accessibility standards and then to enforce them in different sectors. And to its credit, the Ontario government passed an information and communication accessibility standard in 2011, and it mandated compliance with the World or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 that were then the lead requirement. Now, we had to really fight to get that standard, and it was actually AA standard. We had to really fight for that, but we got it. The problems are threefold. Number one, the government never deployed effective enforcement. Their enforcement's been pathetic or paltry, depending on the day. And on a really bad day, it's been both pathetic and paltry. The second thing is that the government, at the time, exempted a number of organizations from having to comply, such as smaller organizations, which is kind of ridiculous because people who are creating new web content can create it accessibly at the start and progressively, and whether they're a big organization or a small one. And the third problem is the regulations, fell out of date. There are, new. It didn't cover mobile apps because that wasn't a thing back then. It didn't cover web applications. It was really more designed for static web content. The government has in hand and has been sitting for about 4 years on recommendations on how to update it, but they haven't. By the way, I said there were 3 problems. Here's a 4th. Stephen, the standard way of thinking about regulation of the economy, not just in Canada, but in many countries is, first you regulate the government, then you require it of big organizations, and the last people to comply should be the small organizations like small businesses. And because they're going to take the longest and they have the least capacity. Well, if you think about it, that makes sense in some contexts. It makes absolutely no sense in the web content context. A small organization that has a small web presence can fix it and update it in much shorter time than, the government of Ontario or a major corporate organization. They have much bigger websites. They got a lot more to do to fix them. A small organization can fix them more quickly. So the idea of saying we're going to give the least time to the people who need the most time and the most time to the people who need the least time is ultimately counterproductive. And that's what the Ontario government did.
I mean, based on everything you're saying, how can you remain that unstoppable optimist, David? I don't get it.
I'll tell you why. Number one, I love Star Trek. I'm used to having a vision of an optimistic future, though I don't have 300 years to wait, sadly. But the other reason is because we've fought these battles before. I was involved in 1980 in the fight with many others to get disability added to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, equality for people with disabilities. Now, when we set about to fight for that in 1980, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have social media, we didn't even have personal computers. We had no real way to network across the country. And I, at that point, did the advocacy as a volunteer on behalf of the CNIB. But collectively, we won. And I've written a memoir of that fight, and the title of the memoir should tell it all to you and our listeners. It's entitled Swimming Up Niagara Falls, because that's what it felt like.
Yeah.
But we got there. by the way, it's available online now for free. Just Google Swimming Up Niagara Falls. It's also on Kindle as for 99 cents or something. But it's available as a free download, and it's being recorded by CNIB as an audiobook. And as soon as that's available, we'll be wanting to make it available, if possible, with to anyone who wants to grab it and download it, not having to be a client of CNIB. Stay tuned on that. But so I'm an optimist because I'm used to taking on battles that objectively and quite rationally look impossible. I'm also fortified because I'm retired as a lawyer, but I'm teaching law on a part-time basis at a couple of law schools. And I am really enthused by the next generation of young people, including young people with disabilities, who are ready to hit the ground running, who know how to use the internet, who know how to use social media, who aren't going to put up with these barriers.
And ultimately, and as you said yourself, this was an historic law. So this was something which hasn't been replicated anywhere else in the world. So I guess optimism can come from the fact that it does exist. At least there's somewhere to start from. You're not beginning the campaign for this act today.
No, not at all. And in fact, we started in Ontario. It's the first comprehensive accessibility law in Canada. At least 5 other provinces have done the same since then. And our federal government has. Now, some of those other laws are weaker and some of them are a bit stronger. We all have the same problems, but we are eager to make progress here in Ontario and for others to meet us or beat us.
So that's the question, I guess, for our listeners. What can they do? What can people do listening who live in Ontario, who perhaps want to support from outside Ontario? What can people do to help you in your cause?
Okay, well, first, this is important for people, not just in Ontario, but if you live elsewhere in Canada or anywhere around the world, because you might want to come to Ontario. Stay in one of our hotels, and unless it's an American chain, likely you're not going to have Braille on the room numbers in the hotel. That's easy to fix. But no one's put it in an access standard in Ontario, and it's not been fixed. So all of you have an interest in this. Go to our website, www.aodaalliance.org, aodaalliance.org. Right on the homepage, look for the sign-up link to sign up to get our updates, our newsletters. We put them out regularly, often more than once a week, and every one of them will update you and then have a section called How You Can Help. And it will have action tips. So, for example, I mentioned that on January 6th, we unveiled the Accessible Ontario Pledge that we're asking politicians to make here. We will be putting out action tips on how to help us pressure politicians to do this. And people could write those politicians whether they live here, or they could write and say, look, I don't live in Ontario, but I want to consider coming there as a tourist. But I have a disability, and I'm not going to pick Ontario as a tourist destination if it doesn't do a better job on accessibility. And those kind of steps can help even if you're not from Ontario.
Of course, Justin Trudeau has stood down as Prime Minister, and I guess there may well be an election coming soon across Canada. Does that, the potential result of that election affect anything that's happening with this particular act, or does it perhaps have an impact on the desire to fix the problems?
Here's the significance. In Canada, responsibility over the barriers we face is divided between the federal government and the provincial government based on the way Canada's constitution is written. And please don't ask me to explain it. I will put our listeners to sleep, as I do to law students. But what I can tell you is that most of the barriers we face in education, in healthcare, and access to goods and services are the responsibility of the province. So a law like the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act is needed. However, there are a number of barriers we face that are in federal responsibility. So we need the government of Canada to fix them. Now, in 2019, the federal government commendably passed a law called the Accessible Canada Act. And it purports to address accessibility in the federal sphere in banking, air travel, federal services, access to television and telecommunication programming, and so on. Unfortunately, that law, it had some improvements over the Ontario law and several significant weaknesses compared to the Ontario law. And I and many others advocated to get that law passed. And I just appeared before Parliament a couple of months ago to point out in a 5-year review what's missing and how they should fix it. Now, if there is a federal election, and there's required to be one this year, you can rest assured that the coalition I serve, and I'm sure others, will be writing the federal party leaders and asking them to make commitments on what they will do to address barriers facing people with disabilities in the federal sphere. So if we have an election in Ontario and a federal one this year, we'll be busy as volunteers on two fronts at the same time.
David Lepofsky, it's wonderful talking to you as always. Thank you so much for coming on.
Always great to talk to you, and I love the program.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. Take care. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Get in touch in all the usual ways. We'll catch you again for another Double Tap tomorrow.